In the silent ocean between galaxies, a shadow waits, older than light, hungrier than time itself. The crew of the Odyssey Dawn does not yet know it, but every breath they take is already counted by the darkness ahead. The universe was a vast, unbroken canvas, painted in shades of black so deep they seemed to drink the starlight. Against this endless backdrop drifted the Odyssey Dawn, a slender spear of silver slicing through the void. Its engines whispered a low, steady hum, the only heartbeat in a place where even echoes could not survive. The crew had grown used to the silence. It was the kind that pressed against the skull, the kind that made human thoughts sound louder than they truly were. Their mission had been simple, at least on paper. A long-range, deep space survey beyond the fringes of mapped territory. They had crossed the outer rim of known space weeks ago, leaving the comfort of familiar constellations behind. Here, stars thinned out, scattered like faint embers in an infinite night. Yet, for all the emptiness, there was a peculiar sensation that they were not entirely alone. It had started as a whisper in the data logs, a faint, repeating signal. At first, the instruments dismissed it as background cosmic radiation. But as days passed, the signal's rhythm sharpened, almost too precise to be random. The ship's AI identified it as coming from a single point in space, far beyond their planned trajectory, but close enough to tempt curiosity. The captain, calm as the glassy dark outside, had altered course. The decision was recorded in the log without ceremony, but in the eyes of the crew, there was an unspoken shift. Even in deep space, instinct still mattered, and something about the signal tugged at the human mind in ways instruments could not measure. The journey toward the source became a slow, deliberate glide. Outside, the stars grew stranger. Patterns that had guided generations of astronomers bent into new shapes. Gravity itself seemed to hum beneath the hull, faint but undeniable. The ship's clock kept its beat, yet some aboard felt as though time had thickened, stretching between moments like cooled glass. Days bled into nights without distinction. The crew moved through the narrow corridors in measured steps, voices lowered, though no one could explain why. The mess hall became quieter. Meals were eaten with the soft clink of metal on polymer trays, the air carrying a tension that clung like static. A few of them confessed, in private, hesitant tones, to dreaming of the same thing, a single black sphere, framed by an impossible ring of fire, turning ever so slowly in the dark. The sphere drew closer. At first, it was invisible, masked by the sheer emptiness surrounding it. But the AI's instruments painted its presence in data, a gravitational field so vast it warped the path of light itself. They could see its signature long before its face appeared. The readings called it a singularity, a collapsed star so dense that even time had no choice but to bow. But the human brain resisted such words. It was easier to think of it as a predator, silent, patient, and infinitely certain of its prey. When the first visual came through the observation deck, no one spoke. Suspended against the black was something darker still, a hole in reality itself. Around it spun a glowing halo, the accretion disk, gas and dust torn apart at near light speed, blazing in violent colors that bled together. It was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful when seen from the eye of safety. Only here, there was no eye. The storm was everywhere. The ship's sensors reported fluctuations in space-time. Light from distant stars bent into curved, unnatural arcs around the black hole. Their familiar twinkles stretched into eerie halos. Looking at it for too long made some feel ill, as if their bodies were struggling to decide where they were in the universe. The signal they had been following pulsed again, louder now, more insistent. It was not random static. It had structure, almost like a song played on an instrument older than the universe. The crew could not explain it, but some swore it resonated inside their bones. Every note of it seemed to promise that answers lay ahead, if only they dared to cross a boundary no human had ever returned from. They named it, though no record shows who said it first, Event Horizon. It was not the scientific term that mattered, but the weight it carried, the edge beyond which nothing could escape. That edge now hung in front of them like a dark shoreline. The captain adjusted course again. The Odyssey Dawn would not simply skirt the danger, it would approach. The hull groaned almost imperceptibly as thrusters realigned, pushing the vessel into a path that would carry it deeper into the black hole's influence. Outside, the accretion disk's glow thickened, swirling in furious loops. Occasionally, massive jets of energy erupted from its poles, spearing into space like spears of blue fire. These outbursts lit the observation deck in fleeting flashes, casting the crew's faces in alternating masks of awe and unease. As they closed in, instruments began picking up distortions in the signal. The pattern was changing, expanding. Some swore they could almost detect layers, like a voice with echoes, speaking not just across space, but across time itself. Sleep became elusive. Those who did rest often woke with the sensation of falling, even though the artificial gravity kept their feet firmly on the deck. Others claimed to hear faint hums in the walls of their quarters, a vibration too subtle to measure. The AI reported no mechanical fault. And yet, in the dead of the ship's artificial night cycle, the hum seemed to sync with the signal from the black hole. In the medical bay, records show a mild increase in heart rates along the crew. Nothing alarming, but consistent. The physician chalked it up to prolonged stress and deep space isolation. But the truth was simpler. Something was watching them, and every cell in their bodies knew it. One by one, the crew found themselves drawn to the observation deck, as if the black hole had become their only window worth looking through. Hours could pass unnoticed as they stared into it. The edges of the disk spun faster here, slowing toward the center until the eye vanished into perfect darkness. The mind wanted to fill that darkness with something, but the truth was worse. There was nothing, and nothing was absolute. On the fourth day of approach, the gravitational pull began to register on manual navigation. It was faint but growing, like the slow tightening of an invisible rope. The captain ordered power diverted to the main drives, keeping the ship in a delicate balance. For now, they were still free to turn away. For now. The signal surged again, strong enough to cause minor interference in the ship's communication system. Words from the crew's chatter on the comms broke into static, warped into strange tones before clearing again. One engineer reported that the static seemed to mimic their own voices, repeating them a fraction of a second later, but twisted as if coming from somewhere far older. The black hole filled more of the forward view now. The disk's glow reflected faintly in the ship's polished interior panels, painting the walls in shades of gold, crimson, and deep violet. Shadows lengthened strangely, refusing to match the angle of the light source. The AI calculated their distance to the event horizon with clinical precision, but each recalculation showed it drawing closer even without acceleration. Somewhere in the crew's unspoken thoughts was the question none dared to voice. Had they already crossed the line without realizing it? Was the moment of choice already behind them, hidden in some subtle bend in the space they had drifted through? The hum in the walls grew stronger. The signal swelled, and in the black heart of the hole, something seemed to move. The first time the signal shaped itself into something more than noise, it did not announce the change with grand gestures. It arrived in the narrow space between events, in the small hours of the ship's artificial night when the hum of circulation fans grew louder for lack of competition. It came as a tremor in the background, a ripple through the constant static, a soft turning of a wheel hidden behind layered metal and woven cable. Those awake felt it in the approach of a thought that was not entirely their own. Those asleep felt it as a draft through a sealed room. Before the crew gave it a name, the ship gave it numbers. The AI counted peaks and valleys, indexed frequencies, and charted a lattice of harmonics like a star map built from sound. The grid filled quickly. Gaussian noise gave way to a repeating scaffold. The scaffold gained ornamentation. Ornamentation grew into architecture. Within the architecture lay a motion not unlike a heartbeat, though this pulse did not match any human rhythm. It moved too slowly, then too quickly, then balanced itself on the edge of both, as if it were learning by trying human tempos on for size. The Odyssey Dawn responded with the reflex of organisms in a new ecosystem. Watchfulness spread. Eyes lingered longer on the observation deck's black pane. Fingers hovered above controls that did not strictly need managing. Sleep rotations shifted without an order. Some crewmates gravitated toward wakefulness precisely when others longed for rest, and any attempt to formalize a schedule kept dissolving as if time itself were a liquid failing to hold its shape. The physician noticed small deviations first. Pupillary responses sharpened. Reaction times shortened by fractions, then by slivers that became measurable. Blood pressure rose and settled as though synchronized by an unseen metronome. The difference was subtle enough to argue with, yet persistent enough to become undeniable once charted. In the hydroponics bay, a stand of basil thickened more than expected between morning and morning, and a single vine in the corners took on a twist that resembled the spiral in the spectrogram of the signal. None of it would have mattered if the crew had been on a survey loop closer to home. But here, at the edge of a gravity well that inhaled starlight, each coincidence carried a heavier weight. The signal learned them slowly. It mapped their patterns and echoed them back with imperfections that revealed the copying process. In the comm array, the carrier tone would thin briefly, as if stretched. In that stretch, a shape appeared, an amplitude modulated by a trace that matched the ship's rotational drift. A day later, that trace corrected itself before the ship corrected the drift, as if forecasting a nudge the captain had not yet decided to make. The AI flagged it, then flagged itself, submitting a diagnostic with a caution that its models were being influenced by something external. The caution was an act of modesty. The influence was undeniable. On the 5th day of approach, when the accretion disk's glow had become a slow rainbow that painted the corridor junctions with a permanent faux sunset, the signal began adding a tail to each pulse. The tail contained a pattern softer than sound. The crew felt it rather than heard it. To call it a feeling would be too imprecise, and to call it a thought would be too forward.
It was a nudge toward association.
It was a suggestion that the mind fill in a blank, and the mind, eager to complete shapes, obliged. Memories surfaced unbidden. Not the bright, polished recollections that people use to define themselves, but the intermediate ones, the weight of a childhood blanket in cold air, the smell of ozone before summer lightning, the tremble in the legs after a long descent down a mountain, the ache under the ribs left by a held breath too long, the bite of ice water on teeth in the dark kitchen before dawn. They arrived like postcards without stamps, addressed from nowhere, signed by no one. Each memory carried a trace of the signal's rhythm, and each departure from the rhythm returned the listener to the observation deck's infinite window, where the black sensor swallowed a rim of light with the casual hunger of weather. The crew tried to catalog it, because cataloging was the only control they had. The linguist, Their presence on board, a quirk of the mission's design, a nod to the possibility of far-flung civilizations, recorded hours of the signal and layered it with every model from ritual chant to whale song to the long-period variability of dying stars. The overlay revealed a stable spine across the noise. The spine warped under gravity's pressure, but it held. The linguist called it a phonology without a language, a mouth without a body, a grammar searching for a mouth. The description diffused through the ship like a joke told too quietly and taken too seriously. They began to experiment. The communications officer launched narrow beams into the dark, aimed slightly off the center of the hull to skim the warped geometry where light curved back upon the ship's own shadow. The beams carried simple constructions, repeating prime numbers, stepped tones, smooth ramps. Each message went out like a hand into a cave. Each time, the hand returned with a smudge of black dust. The signal answered not with direct reflection, but with a change in its own cadence that suggested it had perceived the attempt. The answer did not mirror their message. It did something stranger. It widened its window to admit a new interval that matched approximately the delay of the ship's outgoing beam, taking the long path around the bent light behind the hole. The universe pincered around them. Stars collapsed toward the rim of their vision, dragging after images. Outside the viewport, the accretion disk thickened into a river of fire circling a drain too black to see. Within that forgotten gravity, photons negotiated their lives with terms that changed by millimeter. Their paths bent and bent again until they broke free or were swallowed. The observation deck became a theater whose stage played the oldest story, light, running from darkness and meeting it anyway. The crew stood in the aisles of that theater and adjusted to the story's pacing. Next came the dreams that were not dreams. In the slow hours before wake cycles, several found themselves in the same place. A coastline made of powdered ash beneath a sky the color of old coins. The sea rolled without waves. It did not foam. It thickened at the edge and sank in slow motion to mirror itself. On the far horizon, something that might have been a city wrote and rewrote its skyline in a script of angles that almost made sense. There was no sun, only a higher brightness, and that brightness was not above but around. The dreams followed the same arc: a walk toward the city, a smell like dust and salt, a sense of being addressed by geometry rather than speech, a feeling of turning back at the precise moment when the skyline resolved into something human and the human brain refused to look. Attempts to ignore the shared landscape failed because its details were too specific to be coincidence, and because the signal's spine, the slow pulsing lattice, tightened during the hours when the dreams arrived. The AI reported a measurable increase in coherence twice every day cycle, aligning with the crew's REM plateaus, as if the source of the signal had learned the gentle tides of human sleep and chosen its moments accordingly. When the captain ordered a deliberate test of the phenomenon, it felt less like a command than a concession to inevitability. They would send another beam, not a simple ladder of tones, but a carefully shaped envelope matching the timing of the crew's own pulse when averaged over a watch. The envelope spread, softened, and backed away, repeating over intervals long enough to brush against the slowed seconds of the gravity well's edge. They launched it during the crest of the next coherence swell. The reply arrived as pressure in the chest before it arrived in the instruments. Several crew members paused mid-step, mid-spoon, mid-sentence that was not a sentence, each registering a simultaneously shared skip in the regular pace of the world. The AI flagged a microsecond, too small to touch a human nerve by itself, yet somehow perfectly placed to be felt when repeated across a chorus of neurons ready to fire together. The spectrograph traced the signal's new contour, and the new contour looked like breath taken through a parted door. They began to suspect the outline of an intention. Intention, however, can be the most dangerous mirage. Humans see patterns in rocks and faces in clouds. The black hole's rim presented a canvas for pareidolia on a cosmological scale. To guard against this, they introduced rigor like a new religion. They randomized beam shapes. They varied intervals by prime offsets. They asked the signal for nothing, and they asked it for everything, in the measured way of scientists disguising prayer. Over and over, the correlation returned. When the ship slowed a fraction to maintain position, the signal widened, as if making room for the drag of their time. When they sped up, it tightened, as if cinching around a faster clock. When they went quiet, truly quiet, across every instrument that made a record of their being, the signal descended into a murmur that was not indifference, but listening. The black center remained unchanged, and yet the crew could not shake the feeling that the hole had grown an edge, and that the edge had grown ears. On the seventh day, as the ring outside appeared to thicken without truly changing, an illusion of perspective in a geometry where perspective had few rights, the engineer in charge of the thermal radiators found frost patterns in the coolant vents that repeated the same spiral the Basel had adopted in hydroponics. The frost had no right to exist in that chamber, and yet there it was, a fractal of curves that mirrored the signal's secondary harmonics. When warmed, the pattern dissolved as any frost would. When cooled again, it returned, as if the ship had learned the pattern at the level of crystals and would not forget. The crew started speaking less in the few hours speech would have been possible. Not because fear had silenced them, but because words had grown awkward around the thing that was happening. Conversations turned into shared looks, head tilts toward the dark window, hands hovering above panel glass. The ship felt like a library, and the black hole felt like a reader waiting for the next page to be turned. Each action began to carry the weight of a line break. They discovered the first true echo by accident. During a diagnostic, the communications officer replayed a recording of the signal's spine, sped up and filtered to isolate the fourth harmonic. In the far right channel of the analysis, where no output had been routed, a low artifact rose and fell. It matched a pattern not spoken, formed by the mind of the linguist while thinking about the signal's intervals. The mental counting had been silent. The artifact had no source in the ship's hardware. The artifact's timing matched the imagined numbers. The linguist refused to claim it, then allowed the possibility of coincidence, then conceded to the mounting statistical odds against chance once a second and a third test returned the same shape. The signal, it seemed, had begun to use the crew's minds as an additional medium, not reading thoughts in a theatrical sense, more like encouraging neurons to settle into grooves that the signal had chiseled gently into the air. When those grooves aligned, the mind's private rhythms added their faint lines to the larger graph. The effect was fragile, easily ruined by fear, disrupted by irritation, undone by hunger. Calm, however, amplified it. When calm was present, the signal's whisper found purchase in the busy edges of attention and gently folded them into a wider rope. The captain permitted a controlled exposure. A subset of the crew assembled in the observation deck with instructions to simply sit and look. No tasks, no measures, no goals. To be present, neither resisting nor leaning forward. The AI reduced ambient noise, dimmed the lights, and stabilized the gravity plate. Outside, the ring's river made another lap. Jets of blue-white lanced from the black pole and vanished into a distance the eye could not hold. The spine of the signal arrived as usual, but woven into it was a new thread so faint it could not be heard, only known. The thread described an arc that began at the left edge of the crew's visual field, rose across the center, and disappeared to the right. Everyone present sensed the same itinerary, and when the captain raised a hand and traced that arc in the air without comment, all felt the thread brighten, as if rewarded by being met. What followed could not be called language, but it could be called exchange. The signal produced a series of arcs, each matched by a gesture drawn slowly in the dim room by the captain and mirrored tentatively by others. Vertical, diagonal, spiral, ellipse. The gestures were simple enough to be universal, complex enough to admit an answer. The signal reinforced matched arcs with a deepening of its low root, a near base the ear could not catch, but the sternum could. Mismatched arcs were met with silence. After a time, the crew's gestures synchronized. After more time, the gestures began to coordinate into sequences: spiral, ellipse, spiral, until the sequence spelled something as close to hello as the human brain could construct without words. They ended the session before exhaustion spoiled the purity of the connection. No one wanted to cheapen the discovery with strain. The ship's log recorded the time, the gestures, the corresponding modulations in the signal, and the subjective reports of those present. The reports converged enough to break through skepticism without destroying the careful humility that had to be preserved if they were to stay safe at the edge of impossible gravity. With exchange came attachment. It was impossible to trade even this primitive vocabulary without feeling responsibility for the conversation. The crew would not have admitted to nurturing affection for a gravitational phenomenon, but the body does not wait for permission to form bonds. Something out there, at the rim of forever, had noticed them, and noticing is the first ingredient in every relationship. The fear remained, but it took on a different texture, less a sharp blade and more a heavy fabric draped over the shoulders. The Odyssey Dawn adjusted station-keeping thrusters and crept closer. The AI ran calculations that predicted, with uncomfortable confidence, that their current balance could hold for a time measured in days if no outbursts from the accretion disk disrupted the fragile equilibrium. The captain framed this as a window. The crew experienced it as a tide. They would learn as much as they could while the tide held and leave before the tide changed. The signal had other ideas. On the 9th day, it shifted in a way none had seen. The spine divided into twin strands, then into 4, then braided itself into a thicker rope. The rope pulsed in a slow crescendo, building like the intake of breath that precedes speech. Around the same time, those not on watch moved through the ship with an odd conviction that something important was about to begin, as if they were actors who had been given pages of a script they had never rehearsed. In hydroponics, the basil released a sweet smell all at once, a green perfume strong enough to make the air taste like a meadow in summer. In the engine room, a tool rolled an inch on a flat surface and came to rest pointing toward the observation deck, an absurdity that still happened anyway. In the mess, cups not quite finished with their contents tipped without falling, their surfaces tensed like eyelids. Everywhere on the ship, the signal asked for attention. The answer arrived on the rim of perception. Light outside paused, or seemed to. The ring froze at the top of its turn, then resumed with a micro-lurch. The AI reported a transient warping strong enough to daylight subtle differences in onboard clocks that had remained reconciled under lesser tension. The discrepancy measured in microseconds. The sensation measured in wonder. Within that pause, the crew felt a notion forming. Not a pronunciation, not a phrase, an intention shaped like a path, inward, through and out. The path drew itself across everyone at once, a shared blueprint written in the private medium of thought. It did not show specifics. It did not threaten. It did not promise. It revealed a corridor like a thread in fabric, an improbable route through geometry that should not allow corridors. To follow would mean crossing a threshold beyond which no particle returns. The signal did not hide that fact. It did, however, propose that not everything that crosses must be a particle. The crew held still, as if movement might frighten the pathway. The captain steadied breath until it matched the spine's new walking cadence. The AI verified what it could, which was very little. Instruments designed to measure light were poor at mapping invitations. The linguist looked into the black and felt an ache like nostalgia for a place never visited. The physician, usually most skeptical, found tears without sadness rising, unsteady as the ship's artificial gravity learned the pressure of a new idea. The communications officer ran a hand above the panel and saw in the periphery a shimmer that died when looked at directly. The shimmer had the same shape as the corridor the mind had been given. Before fear could reclaim the room, the signal softened. The braided rope unwound. The spine returned to its earlier calm, as if to say that nothing had been forced and nothing would be. The crew understood this as permission to not decide yet. And yet, in the hours after, decisions began to decide themselves. They tightened protocols. They tuned redundancy systems until their graphs sang straight lines. They recorded everything twice. They wrote letters they did not send. They held personal rituals, tiny, private gestures that mark endings and beginnings in a way that neither the universe nor the clock respects and that humans crave anyway. The ship changed very little to the eye, but to those aboard, its rooms had moved half an inch to the left, the way a familiar house feels when someone has left or arrived. Late in the watch, as the accretion disk dimmed and brightened by turns that might have been physical or might have been the eye adjusting to new courage, the signal sent a last small lesson. The twin strands returned for a heartbeat and wrapped around the crew's attention like a scarf against cold. In that warmth lay a shape that was neither corridor nor warning. It was an image of the ship itself. A slender spear of silver seen from far away, seen moving along the arc of a path too delicate to be navigated by engines alone. The image held an assurance so quiet it almost did not register, a promise to carry if carried with. The Odyssey Dawn drifted on her station, a point of will at the edge of an appetite. The crew folded into their bunks as if into the pockets of a larger hand. The observation deck remained awake because it had no eyelids. The horizon was not a line, but a volume. Beyond it lay a night so deep it had a shape. The signal's whisper faded to a murmur, then to a breath just audible enough to know the conversation was merely paused. Morning would bring choices. Night offered preparation. Somewhere within all of it, an ancient darkness had learned to knock softly, and human beings had learned to listen without running. They did not yet know that listening can be a form of movement. They did not yet know that attention, given in the right shape, is a kind of fuel. They slept near the edge of an idea so large that time itself bent closer to hear it. And the whole, patient as geology and quick as lightning, waited with the calm of forces that do not need impatience to achieve their ends. When the crew awoke, the ship's clocks agreed more closely than ever. The hydroponics bay smelled faintly of basil and rain. The frost returned exactly where it had been and then melted as the lights warmed. The basil spiral leaned nearer the pattern promised by the corridor, though no one measured. The engineer's tool lay perfectly still on the flat surface, no longer pointing to the observation deck, because no pointer was needed. The corridor, if that is what it truly was, had stopped being a suggestion laid across the mind and had become, imperceptibly, a direction embedded in their bones. Outside, the black circle drank from its glowing river and made no sound. Inside, hearts matched a new metronome. The signal whispered again. The ship answered by existing. The conversation continued. The pull began before anyone truly admitted it was happening. It was not the violent lurch of a ship caught in a planet's gravity, nor the rattling tug of a failed thruster correction. It was gentler than that. So gentle, in fact, that the human body almost mistook it for stillness. Only the ship's AI knew with certainty. The Odyssey Dawn was no longer maintaining her station. The black hole had extended its reach, and something deep within the hull had begun to answer. The crew awoke to find the stars subtly rearranged in the observation deck's window. The familiar distortion that curved the light at the edges of the view had thickened, pulling more of the background sky into an arc. Starlight seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to complete its journey or turn back toward the impossible center. The accretion disk was brighter now, a molten crown whose glow painted the ship's corridors in perpetual twilight. Even with the lights at full, the golden red wash of that distant ring seeped in, giving every surface the warmth of sunset and the weight of inevitability. In the mess hall, they spoke little. Meals were eaten slowly, utensils setting down with a kind of unspoken reverence, as though noise might draw the attention of something that had already noticed them. The captain's presence was calm, but there was an edge to it, a stillness too precise, like the balance before a diver takes the final step from the platform. Orders were given in measured tones, not to hide fear, but to avoid feeding it. The AI delivered the update without flourish. The black hole's gravitational gradients had increased by a measurable factor overnight. This was expected at their distance, yet the numbers carried more weight than any expectation. The ship's forward momentum had been trimmed to compensate, but the correction required more thrust than it should have. It was as if the space ahead had thickened, each meter heavier than the last. They all knew what the calculations meant. They were falling. Not fast, not yet, but the slope had steepened beneath them, and slopes rarely flattened near a black hole. In the engineering bay, the hum of the main drives was constant, a reminder of the energy required to simply exist here. The chief engineer checked readouts with the devotion of a surgeon monitoring a patient mid-operation. Heat exchangers whispered under strain. Magnetic containment fields flexed, not dangerously, but enough for the sensors to notice. The black hole's pull was not merely gravitational. It was a tide pressing against every field the ship generated, as if testing them for weaknesses. Some of the crew reported feeling heavier, though the artificial gravity had not changed. Others felt the opposite, a faint lightness in the joints, a sensation like walking just after swimming in the sea. The physician recorded the variations without judgment, noting that they coincided with subtle fluctuations in the signal's pulse. The connection was speculative, but here, at the edge of the event horizon's influence, speculation had begun to feel like another form of measurement. The signal itself had changed again. The clean spine they had grown accustomed to was now layered with faint, irregular harmonics, like the breath of someone who had begun to run but was not yet winded. These harmonics carried no obvious pattern. Yet, when isolated and replayed, they produced a sensation in the listener, something between anticipation and warning. The linguist described it as the sound of looking over one's shoulder in the dark, an image that needed no translation. Sleep became more restless. Dreams shifted from the coastline of ash and still water to something more abstract, spirals of light collapsing into themselves, corridors that stretched forever but ended abruptly, shapes glimpsed in periphery that dissolved when faced directly. These were not nightmares in the traditional sense. They lacked fear's sharp edge, replacing it with a slow, pressing weight, like a hand resting steadily on the back of the mind. By the third day of their slow drift, the crew noticed changes in the accretion disk's behavior. Jets of energy burst from the poles more frequently, lancing into the void with the precision of a heartbeat. The light they cast revealed details of the disk they had not seen before. Knots of brightness, swirling eddies of gas, shadows cast not by objects, but by the very curvature of space itself. It was as though the black hole were flexing, its muscles moving beneath the skin of its swirling halo. The AI detected something else: time dilation. It was slight, but measurable. Clocks aboard the Odyssey Dawn were drifting ahead of synchronized pulses from the deep space relay network they had left far behind. Aboard the ship, the seconds felt normal, but to anyone far away, if there were anyone, those seconds were already stretching. The effect was still small enough to ignore in practice, but its presence was undeniable. They had entered the outer reach of the well. The captain gathered them in the central briefing room. No speech was made. Instead, a new navigational chart was projected into the air between them, a three-dimensional model of their position relative to the black hole. The event horizon was marked as a dark sphere in the center, surrounded by the glowing bands of the accretion disk. Their ship was a single point in the open space, just outside a faint, translucent shell, the photon sphere, the place where light itself could be trapped in orbit before plunging inward. The captain let the image rotate slowly, the silent turn of a predator in the deep. The meaning was clear. They were now inside the influence of something that could bend even the straightest path into a spiral. Every decision from this point forward would be a contest between the ship's engines and the will of the gravity well. As if sensing their recognition, the signal flared. The braided threads they had seen before returned, spinning into a complex weave that shivered across the sensors. This time, the pattern was faster, almost urgent. It repeated, adjusted, and repeated again, as though trying to compensate for the distortion of space between them. The linguist suggested it was a warning. The communications officer thought it might be an invitation. The engineer wondered aloud if it was simply a map, coordinates that only made sense from where they now stood. In the hours that followed, the crew noticed the ship's systems behaving in ways that defied normal diagnostics. Cooling cycles seemed to anticipate heat loads before they occurred. Navigation subroutines adjusted minor course deviations without being instructed. Even the lighting shifted subtly, dimming before someone entered a corridor, brightening near a workstation before hands touched the controls. The AI insisted these were within operational parameters, yet the timing was too precise, the intuition too human. They began to feel as though the Odyssey Dawn itself had become part of the conversation with the black hole. On the fifth day, the pull intensified. The engines worked harder to hold position, and fuel consumption rose. The captain authorized a controlled drift inward, reducing thrust to conserve reserves. The AI plotted a spiral trajectory that would carry them closer to the event horizon, without committing them to a descent they could not reverse, at least in theory. This brought the view outside into sharper focus. The disk's inner edge, a boiling wall of light, now filled the lower half of the observation deck's window. Above it stretched a sky warped into impossible curves, stars smeared into lines by the bending of spacetime. The signal grew louder in the sensors. It no longer felt like a distant broadcast, but like a resonance vibrating through the ship's frame. When they stood still, they could feel it in their feet. When they closed their eyes, they could sense its rhythm aligning with their pulse. Some found it comforting. Others found it unbearable. No one could ignore it. At night, the dreams deepened. Now there was motion in them. Slow turns through corridors lit by the same gold-red glow as the accretion disk. Walls that curved in ways the mind could not map. Sometimes they felt the presence of others, never seen, only sensed, like figures just around the bend. And always there was the corridor, the one shown in thought during the earlier exchange. It was clearer now, its walls smooth and seamless, its end lost in a darkness that felt less like absence and more like a destination. The engineer began running private calculations, trying to model what would happen if they followed the path implied by the signal. The results were incomplete, filled with variables they could not measure, but one truth emerged. Once inside the event horizon, conventional physics would no longer predict their fate. The ship could be torn apart in moments, or it could survive in ways no one could yet describe. The captain did not forbid these calculations. Instead, they allowed them to spread, as if testing the crew's willingness to even contemplate such a crossing. The responses were mixed. Some were eager, driven by the lure of the unknown. Others recoiled, unwilling to gamble their lives against a force that had consumed stars. But even those who resisted found their thoughts returning to the corridor, to the sense of a path waiting to be taken. The black hole's presence was no longer just outside. It had entered them. The pull was physical, yes, but it was also mental, emotional. It was in the way conversations trailed off mid-sentence as eyes drifted toward the observation deck. It was in the way footsteps slowed in the corridors, as though space itself were thicker here. It was in the way the signal's harmonics had begun to sound almost like breathing. On the 7th day of the drift, the AI reported a new anomaly. The Odyssey Dawn's mass readings had shifted. By an infinitesimal amount, yes, but enough to measure. The change could not be explained by fuel consumption or resource usage. Something in the ship's structure had become heavier, though nothing physical had changed. The engineer likened it to carrying a memory so dense it bent the mind around it. The captain simply nodded. Outside, the event horizon loomed larger. The ring of the accretion disk burned brighter, its motion so fast it seemed still, like a wheel spinning beyond the eye's ability to track. Beyond it lay the black, perfect, unbroken, infinite. It was not absence. It was presence so complete that no light could exist alongside it. The signal pulsed again, steady, patient. It was no longer whispering. It was speaking in a language beyond words, a language of rhythm, gravity, and inevitability. The crew could feel it in their bones, in the spaces between their thoughts. It was telling them something they already knew. The well had them now, and the only way out might be through. They stood on the deck together, gazing into the dark. The stars behind them were already losing their familiar shapes. Time was bending, space was curving, and somewhere ahead, the corridor waited. The choice was coming. Light should have been constant. It should have flowed from the distant stars in straight, obedient lines, a steady reminder that even here, on the edge of the most dangerous place in the known universe, the laws of physics still held. But as the Odyssey Dawn slipped deeper into the gravity well, light began to behave like a living thing, restless and easily startled. It started subtly, in the observation deck, where the curve of the accretion disk seemed sharper than before. At certain angles, the light from the disk fractured into bands, thin ribbons of color stacked like the layers of a prism turned on its side. These bands shifted and bent when the ship moved, but not always in ways that matched their trajectory. Sometimes they trembled without cause, as though disturbed by invisible waves passing between the ship and the source. The crew noticed other changes too. Shadows no longer obeyed the angles of their light sources. In the mess hall, a cup left on the table cast a shadow that curved slightly, curling toward the nearest viewport even when the light was directly overhead. In the engineering bay, a dropped tool threw a shadow that lagged a fraction of a second behind its fall, like a memory struggling to catch up to the present. The AI confirmed these distortions were not equipment malfunctions. The ship was still structurally sound. It was the space around them that had begun to warp. The black hole's influence had reached the level where gravitational lensing dominated the view. The AI's holographic displays could still show a corrected image, flattening the distortions into something resembling the starfield they knew, but most of the crew preferred the raw view. There was something mesmerizing in the way light curved toward the darkness, bending in arcs that seemed almost artistic. Entire constellations folded over themselves, their points of light looping into spirals before straightening again. It was as though the universe were leaning toward the black hole, bowing to its presence. Even the disk itself had transformed. No longer just a glowing ring, it now showed detail upon detail. Layers of dust and plasma rippled across its surface like the skin of a living ocean. Eddies spun in perfect circles, some the size of continents, others no bigger than cities. At the inner edge, the glow was so intense it should have been blinding. But here, distance and the filtering effect of warped light softened it into a deep, molten gold. Every so often, a flare of energy burst from the disk, a brilliant lance of blue-white plasma stretching thousands of kilometers into the void, its edges shimmering with subatomic particles torn from their bonds. It was during one of these flares that the crew saw something new. In the instant of blinding light, the silhouette of the black hole's event horizon sharpened against the glow. It was not a perfect sphere. Its outline shifted slightly, as though the very boundary of space-time were trembling. The change was brief, less than a heartbeat, but it left a lasting impression. Something about the horizon itself was alive. The signal, too, had changed. It was louder now, not in decibels, but in presence. It was as if the black hole's voice had grown closer. Its words carried not just through the comms, but through the very structure of the Odyssey Dawn. The harmonics had deepened, their pattern less random. The linguist described it as syntax without semantics, a sentence whose grammar was clear, but whose meaning remained hidden. Yet, when played back in private, crew members admitted they felt as though they understood it, even if they couldn't explain how. The captain authorized a deeper drift, allowing the ship to inch closer to the photon sphere, the threshold where light could orbit the black hole indefinitely. The AI projected their course in real time, marking their trajectory as a slow spiral inward. The engines murmured softly, countering the pull just enough to avoid an uncontrolled fall. The closer they drew, the stranger the light became. The photon sphere revealed itself not as a single shell, but as a shifting halo, where light from every direction bent and circled before either escaping or plunging into darkness. Through it, they could see impossible views. The back of the accretion disk curling over the top of the black hole, the stars behind them reappearing ahead, warped into ghostly duplicates. It was like looking into a hall of mirrors, where each reflection was a different version of reality. Some of the crew began to experience mild disorientation. Walking the corridors felt subtly wrong, as though the ship itself had elongated or twisted in ways their eyes could not confirm. The physician explained it as a natural response to the conflicting visual cues. Gravity told them one thing, but their eyes told them another. Still, there was an unshakable sense that the Odyssey Dawn was no longer entirely in the space it had departed from. The dreams returned, sharper than before. The corridor from earlier visions was now lit with the same warped light that bent around the photon sphere. The walls shimmered, not reflecting but refracting some unseen glow. The feeling of being observed had intensified. In some dreams, they could sense figures walking parallel to them on the other side of the wall, their forms indistinct but undeniably human in their rhythm of movement. No one saw their faces. No one heard their voices. But they were there. The linguist made a connection between the dreams and the signal. Using crew sleep cycle data, they mapped the moments of peak REM activity against the signal's strongest harmonics. The correlation was near perfect. The black hole, or whatever intelligence existed within or around it, seemed to be timing its communication to coincide with their most receptive mental state. Whether this was coincidence or design, no one could say. By the fifth day within the photon sphere's influence, the Odyssey Dawn's exterior sensors began to register faint echoes, not of the ship's own signals, but of something reflecting from behind the event horizon. This should have been impossible. Nothing escapes from within. Yet here was data suggesting a reflection of sorts, though heavily degraded, as if whatever returned had been stretched thin across an unimaginable distance before reaching them. The captain, against the advice of the AI's conservative protocols, ordered a direct pulse toward the horizon. It was a tight beam transmission of simple harmonic sequences, designed to be unmistakably artificial. The pulse disappeared into the dark. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the signal's harmonics shifted, and the sequences they had sent began to weave themselves into the black hole's own rhythm. It was not a perfect echo, it was altered, reframed, almost as if reinterpreted. The crew reacted in silence, the weight of the moment pressing against them. They had been heard. Not just their sensors, not just their ship, but they had been heard. From that point, shadows inside the Odyssey Dawn became stranger still. Some began to move even when the source of light remained fixed. A shadow might stretch along the floor, pooling in corners, then receding without explanation. Sometimes, in peripheral vision, they seemed to take on shapes, fleeting impressions of figures that vanished when looked at directly. The AI detected no intruders, no energy fluctuations to explain the phenomenon. The crew stopped asking for explanations. The more they tried to define it, the more it seemed to slip beyond definition. Outside, the black hole filled nearly a third of the observation deck's forward view. The accretion disk's inner edge was now a blinding ribbon, and the lensing effect bent its far side up and over the top, creating the illusion of a ring of fire surrounding the darkness. At the center, the horizon was still, and yet in constant motion, a paradox that the human mind could not comfortably hold. The signal began introducing new patterns, flashes of intensity, sudden drops into near silence, then slow climbs back to full strength. These shifts had no obvious meaning, but they stirred the same uneasy recognition as before. The linguist began working on a mapping algorithm, but progress was slow. This was not a code to be broken with mathematics alone. It was a conversation that required patience, intuition, and a willingness to see meaning in shapes that might not yet be complete. One evening, if such a thing could be called evening in a place without days, a flare from the accretion disk lit the ship in brilliant gold. For a fraction of a second, every surface inside seemed to ripple. The crew felt a momentary shift as though gravity had tilted beneath them. In that instant, several claimed they saw something in the blackness. Not a shape exactly, but a depth, a layering, as if the horizon were a veil and something vast stood just behind it. The captain logged the event without speculation. But in the privacy of their quarters, each crew member sat for a long time, staring at the dark outside, wondering if they had seen the same thing, or if the black hole was showing each of them something unique. The drift continued. The engines whispered. The light bent and folded, and the shadows grew longer. They were not yet at the event horizon, but the black hole was no longer simply ahead of them. It was around them. It was in them. Odyssey Dawn, whether by choice or inevitability, was answering its call. The change was not sudden. It came as a deepening of what was already there, a quiet shift in the air, a tightening of the invisible threads that held the Odyssey Dawn in place. The engines still hummed at their usual pitch, yet the subtle tremor beneath their feet told the crew that more power was being spent just to maintain their trajectory. The black hole's hand, patient until now, had closed a fraction tighter. The AI announced the numbers with clinical precision. Thrust output had been increased by 3% to maintain position. It was not much. On paper, it was nothing to worry about. But in space, near a gravity well of this magnitude, every percentage was a warning written in the language of inevitability. The captain listened without reaction, eyes fixed on the projection in the center of the command deck. It showed their position as a single point in a vast three-dimensional model. The black hole's event horizon was represented as a sphere of perfect darkness, surrounded by the luminous band of the accretion disk. Their point was drifting, ever so slightly, along a spiral toward the surface of that darkness. The spiral was faint. The AI insisted they could correct it with a controlled burn. But everyone in the room felt what the projection didn't show, that the space around them had become slippery, like trying to walk up a slope coated in ice. Each correction seemed to last a little less time than the one before. Outside the viewport, the photon sphere dominated the forward view. The bending of light was more extreme now, the warped reflections of the universe curling around them like the inside of a mirrored shell. The stars no longer seemed fixed. They slid slowly, as though the entire cosmos were being poured into the black hole's center. The accretion disk's glow painted everything in shades of gold and copper. It was no longer just a backdrop. It was a constant, pulsing presence, its slow rotations hypnotic. Jets of blue-white energy erupted from the poles more often, and each eruption was accompanied by a faint vibration in the ship's frame. It was not enough to shake anything loose, but it was there, a low, almost musical tremor that resonated in the chest. The signal had grown stronger, its spine more pronounced. The harmonics that once felt like whispers now pressed against the senses, each pulse deep enough to feel in the bones. The linguist had stopped trying to treat it as an abstract pattern. It was no longer just a transmission. It was a presence, one that seemed to be watching their slow descent with a patience that was not entirely passive. In the crew's private hours, the dreams intensified. The corridor from earlier visions was no longer empty. Now there were moments when the indistinct figures seemed to glance toward them, not with faces, not with eyes, but with a kind of attention that could be felt rather than seen. The sense of being observed had deepened into something else, expectation. The AI's navigation routines worked constantly, making micro-adjustments to counter the pull. But with each passing hour, the corrections became more frequent. They were no longer drifting toward the event horizon. They were being drawn. And though the change was slow, it was steady. Everyone knew that kind of steadiness was the most dangerous of all. In engineering, the chief ran diagnostics on the thrusters. They were functioning perfectly. Fuel reserves were stable. By all accounts, the Odyssey Dawn could hold its position for days yet. But the chief kept running the tests, as though hoping to find an error, a malfunction that could be fixed, something to explain the slow tightening of the black hole's grip.
There was no error.
The grip was real. The captain called a meeting in the central briefing room. The holographic display showed two trajectories. One was their current course, a slow inward spiral, manageable for now, but leading inevitably toward the event horizon if the pull continued to strengthen. The other was an escape vector, an aggressive burn away from the black hole's influence, cutting across the outer edge of the photon sphere. The escape was possible, but costly. It would consume a large portion of their fuel reserves, leaving little margin for error on the return journey. No decision was made. The captain said only that they would hold for as long as they could. The unspoken truth was clear. The longer they held, the harder escape would become. Outside, the horizon grew larger. The glow of the disk became so intense that its light cast faint, shifting patterns inside the observation deck. They moved across the walls like reflections from water, except there was no water here, only the bending of light by gravity so strong it was almost tactile. The signal changed again. It no longer pulsed in even rhythms. Instead, it surged and receded in slow waves, like a tide. Each crest seemed to align with a slight increase in the black hole's pull, as though the two were connected. The linguist suggested that the signal was anticipating these surges, or perhaps even causing them. The idea was left unchallenged. The crew began to feel the pull in their bodies, though the artificial gravity remained constant. Some described it as a faint pressure in the chest, as though standing at the base of a tall mountain and looking up. Others felt it as a heaviness in the skull, a subtle awareness of their own weight. The physician noted no measurable changes, but she did not dismiss the reports. In hydroponics, the basil plants had begun to lean not toward the light, but toward the viewport. Their stems curved slowly, their leaves angled as though following some invisible signal. The frost in the cooling vents returned, forming spirals more intricate than before, their shapes echoing the patterns in the signal's harmonics. The AI logged the phenomenon without comment. On the fourth day of the pull, the captain ordered a minor inward drift to conserve fuel, allowing the ship to fall slightly closer to the event horizon. The change was barely perceptible in terms of distance, but the view outside altered dramatically. The inner edge of the disk now appeared larger than the black hole itself, curving over the top of the horizon in a way that made it seem like the darkness was being swallowed by its own light. It was then that the crew saw something none of them could explain. Just above the horizon, in the narrow band where light bent most violently, a shadow moved. It was not the shadow of a planet or moon. There was nothing there to cast it. It shifted against the swirling glow, its shape too irregular to be an artifact of lensing. It appeared for only a moment, then dissolved into the chaos of the disk. But in that moment, every member of the crew felt a single, unmistakable thought. It sees us. The signal surged. The harmonics became sharper, their peaks brighter, their valleys deeper. The linguist's console lit with patterns she had never seen before, structures that seemed to fold in on themselves, each layer revealing another beneath it. It was not random. It was not noise. It was directed. The captain gave no orders. There was nothing to order. The pull had them. The choice to resist or to surrender would come soon, but not yet. For now, they drifted. The nights, if they could still be called nights, grew stranger. In the dreams, the corridor was no longer distant. They were walking through it, their steps soundless on the seamless floor. The figures were closer now, their forms clearer but still indistinct, like reflections in rippled glass. And always, at the far end, was the darkness. It was not threatening. It was waiting. By the seventh day, the AI reported that their position was less stable than before. Micro-adjustments were now needed every few minutes. The escape vector remained possible, but its cost had grown. The captain said nothing about it, but the crew knew. Time was running out, not just in the conventional sense, but in the way it seemed to bend and stretch around them. Days felt both longer and shorter, their edges blurred by the constant pull. The horizon filled the forward view now. It was no longer a distant sphere, but a wall, a surface of pure blackness against which the glow of the disk raged. The curvature of space was visible in the way the stars beyond it twisted and split. The photon sphere shimmered like heat over asphalt, its distortions shifting from moment to moment. The signal did not stop. It had become a constant companion, a background presence that seemed to breathe with the crew. Its rhythms matched their movements, its surges coinciding with the ship's subtle shudders. It was no longer something they listened to. It was something they lived in. And so they continued, caught between the engine's resistance and the black hole's inevitability. The pull was gentle still, but it was relentless. It did not need to rush. Gravity had all the time in the universe. Soon, the event horizon would fill the entire view. And then, the real journey would begin. The crossing was not marked by a crash of alarms or the tearing of metal. There was no visible barrier, no shuddering impact to signal that the Odyssey Dawn had passed the point of no return. Instead, it came as a subtle pause, a stillness so complete that for one suspended heartbeat, even the background hum of the engines seemed to vanish. The AI registered the moment first. A soft chime indicated a system checkpoint, followed by a simple notation: relative velocity unchanged. External coordinates unavailable. That last phrase carried a weight the text could not convey. External coordinates meant their position in the universe beyond the black hole's pull. And now, those coordinates no longer existed in any meaningful way. The event horizon was behind them. Outside the viewport, the universe had changed. The blackness ahead was no longer empty. It was textured, though the mind resisted describing it. It was not darkness in the absence of light, but a darkness filled with something that consumed light before it could reflect. The accretion, disk's glow had disappeared entirely, as though erased, yet their eyes still registered a kind of illumination, muted, internal, as if the scene were being lit from within their own minds. The photon sphere and its bending of starlight were gone. The stars themselves were gone. Only the void remained. But it was not still. It moved in ways that made no sense. Slow undulations, shifting planes, sudden distortions at the edge of vision. Looking directly at these movements made them vanish, but turning away revealed them again in the periphery, like a constant reminder that something vast and unseen was sharing the same space. The crew sat in silence on the observation deck, watching nothing and everything at once. The air seemed thicker here, though all environmental readings were normal. Even the sound of breathing had changed, each inhale and exhale feeling slightly delayed, as though time itself were stretching between them. The AI's instruments still functioned, but their readings were no longer intuitive. Distances fluctuated without warning. Velocity became relative only to the ship's own systems. Direction was meaningless. There was no fixed point to measure against. The AI could track acceleration and deceleration, but where and when had become unmoored from any universal frame of reference. The signal was louder here, not in volume, but in intimacy. It no longer felt like something transmitted from outside. It was inside the ship, inside their bodies, inside the spaces between thoughts. The spine of the signal had deepened into a resonant thrum, slow and deliberate, like the heartbeat of something incomprehensibly large. Harmonies moved around it like currents in deep water, brushing against the edges of perception. The dreams from before were no longer confined to sleep. The corridor appeared in waking moments now, superimposed faintly over the ship's interiors. Walking down the main passageway, one might see the smooth, curving walls of the dream corridor just beneath the familiar surface of the hull. Sometimes, these visions flickered in and out. Other times, they stayed for minutes at a stretch. The figures glimpsed in the dreams were here too, still indistinct, still on the edge of sight, but moving with purpose. In engineering, tools left on work surfaces were found in new positions, as though they had been nudged or examined by unseen hands. In hydroponics, the basil plants had straightened completely, their stems no longer reaching toward any particular direction, but instead standing perfectly upright, as if in attention. The frost in the cooling vents formed a continuous spiral now, unbroken and precise. On the second day inside the horizon, if days could still be counted, the crew began to notice changes in their own perception of time. Some felt that hours were passing in minutes, others that minutes were stretching into hours. The ship's clocks ticked steadily, but no one trusted them anymore. The AI's voice seemed to arrive slightly before or after it should, like an echo from the wrong direction. The captain, as always, remained calm, but their eyes lingered longer on the viewport than before. It was as if they were listening to something beyond the signal, something deeper. When asked if they had heard anything unusual, they simply said, "Everything here is unusual," and left it at that. On the third day, the horizon behind them vanished. There was no longer any visible boundary between where they had come from and where they were. The void had closed around them completely. Yet, strangely, there was no sensation of confinement. The space inside the black hole felt vast, limitless in a way that defied logic. It was as if they had entered a sea without shores. The signal began introducing structures more complex than anything before. These were not just patterns of sound, but layered geometries that the AI attempted to visualize. The results were mesmerizing, shapes folding into themselves, impossible angles rotating in ways that three-dimensional space could not permit. Watching them too long caused a strange sensation, as though the viewer's mind were trying to follow the folds inward, risking becoming lost in their depth. The linguist suggested these shapes were a form of language, but one that could not be translated into words. It was communication by structure, messages written in the architecture of thought itself. Whether the black hole was sending these deliberately, or they were an artifact of some deeper process, no one could say. On the fourth day, the figures revealed themselves more clearly. Not all at once, and not directly, but in glimpses that grew sharper with each encounter. They were tall, slender, their forms fluid, shifting between shapes as though their bodies were made of something halfway between matter and light. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and synchronized, as if each were aware of the other's actions without needing to look. They never approached too closely. They stayed at the edges of perception, watching. But when the crew moved, they moved too, maintaining their distance yet always present. There was no hostility in them, but there was no comfort either. They were an audience, or perhaps observers in an experiment. The captain authorized an experiment of their own. The communications officer generated a series of harmonic sequences modeled after the black hole's own signal patterns and broadcast them into the void. This time, the response was immediate. The harmonics around the ship shifted, wrapping around their transmission and altering it, like a voice repeating a phrase but changing the inflection to suggest a new meaning. The crew felt it more than heard it. A subtle shift in the atmosphere of the ship, a sense of attention sharpening. The figures in the periphery seemed to pause, as though listening too. Then, slowly, the corridor appeared in full. Not in dreams, not in flickers, but in solid, undeniable reality. It stretched out from the observation deck's far wall, its smooth, curved surfaces lit by a diffuse golden glow. The figures stood along its edges, motionless now, their forms clearer than before, human-like but impossibly precise, their features symmetrical yet unfamiliar. The air within the corridor shimmered slightly, as though filled with a gentle heat. No one moved at first. The captain stepped forward slowly, crossing the deck until they stood at the threshold. There was no sensation of crossing into another space. One moment they were in the observation deck, the next they were inside the corridor. The others followed, some cautiously, others as if drawn by an unseen hand. The corridor was silent except for the signal, which now seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls curved away into the distance, with no seams, no doors, no breaks in their smooth surface. The figures moved alongside them, keeping pace without walking. They did not touch, they did not speak, but their presence was undeniable. Time inside the corridor felt different. There was no sense of minutes or hours passing, only movement. The crew walked for what could have been seconds or days, yet they felt neither hunger nor fatigue. The signal guided them forward, its harmonics rising and falling in patterns that seemed to match their steps. At last, the corridor ended, not abruptly, but by opening into a vast open space that defied description. It was not a room nor a void, but something between. The floor was solid, yet the space around them seemed infinite. Above, there was no ceiling, only shifting patterns of light and shadow, like the accretion disk's glow seen through water. In the center of this space hung a structure. It was vast, yet somehow close. Its surface was made of the same impossible geometries the AI had visualized, folding endlessly into itself. It pulsed with the same rhythm as the signal, each beat sending a faint vibration through the air. The crew stood at the edge of this structure, staring. The figures moved past them now, circling the structure, their forms blending into its folds as if they were part of it. The signal reached its deepest resonance, a sound that seemed to vibrate inside their bones. And then, without words, they understood. This was not just the center of the black hole. This was the mind of it. The first sensation was not sound, but weight. Not the crushing force of gravity, but a heaviness in thought itself. Ideas that would normally drift easily to the surface now rose with effort as though pushing through a denser medium. The crew felt it simultaneously, though no one spoke. The silence was not empty, it was occupied. The great structure at the center of the chamber pulsed slowly, its impossible geometry folding and unfolding in rhythms that defied measurement. Each pulse was more than a vibration, it was a presence. The signal they had followed for so long was no longer coming from out there. It was here, woven into every surface, every curve of the room, every breath they took. No one heard a voice, and yet something spoke. The words, or what could only loosely be called words, were built from recognition itself. They arrived as entire concepts, not carried on sound waves, but simply appearing fully formed inside the mind, bypassing the clumsy machinery of language. The first was not even a message, but a statement of fact so simple and vast it made their skin prickle. I am. It was not boast, not claim, just truth, as old as the space around them. The crew did not answer. It didn't seem necessary. The structure seemed to sense their listening, because the second concept came immediately, flowing into their minds like water into a waiting vessel. You are here. The meaning was layered. It was not simply a recognition of physical presence. Here was not just a location, it was a state. They were not simply standing inside the chamber of a black hole. They were inside the place where all trajectories, every path, every orbit, every fall ended. They were in the heart of inevitability. The figures, those slender, shifting beings who had moved in parallel with them for so long, stepped closer now. As they neared, their forms changed subtly, as if adjusting to match the observers. The crew saw faint reflections of themselves in the beings' outlines, gestures, postures, small details mirrored back imperfectly, like memories retold by someone who had not lived them. The captain took a single step toward the structure. The moment they did, the air around them thickened, and the next concept arrived. You come from outside. You carry what is not yet here. The crew felt the weight of those words, though they had no idea what exactly they carried. Memories surfaced unbidden, flashes of oceans under starlight, the scent of rain on soil, the hum of city streets at night. Each memory burned bright for a moment before fading. It was as if the black hole were sampling them, tasting pieces of the universe they had brought in with them. Then came a new pulse, slower, heavier, and the concept deepened. You carry time. This was different. The crew felt it as a pulling sensation in the chest, in the wrists, in the temples, places where pulse could be measured. The black hole had no use for time. Inside the horizon, time had no constant speed, no shared meaning. But the crew did carry it, in their bodies, in their thoughts, in the sequencing of memory. And the singularity was aware of it, curious about it. The captain's mind formed a question without meaning to. What are you? The answer came without pause. I am the place where what was becomes what cannot be. I am the meeting of all paths. I am the shape that space takes when time surrenders. It was not description so much as truth poured into the mold of their understanding. The black hole was not alive in the way they were, but it was not inanimate either. It was a process, a vast, unending act of transformation. It did not simply exist in the universe bent itself around its existence. Another pulse, another layer. I have been many, I have been none. I am singular. The crew felt the edges of their own individuality blur slightly. The boundaries between them, between self and other, were not as sharp here. Thoughts felt more porous, memories more shareable. The figures standing around them seemed to lean closer, as if listening not just to the singularity, but to them. Then came something unexpected. The black hole began to show them things. At first, it was nothing more than shifting patterns, swirls of light and shadow, like the accretion disk's fire as seen from afar. Then the patterns grew clearer, becoming scenes that might have been memories or echoes or visions. The crew stood together, watching as an ocean under a red sun shimmered into view, its surface torn by winds that moved in impossible spirals. They saw mountain ranges taller than anything on Earth, their peaks shrouded in clouds lit from below. They saw stars being born in clouds of gas, then collapsing into darkness centuries later. The scenes were not random. They seemed chosen, each one carrying a thread of meaning the crew could feel but not name. The captain understood first. The singularity was showing them its own memories, not in the human sense of lived experience, but as records of the matter and energy that had crossed its horizon over the ages. Every star, every planet, every fragment of cosmic dust that had fallen inward was still here, not as it had been, but as the black hole had become it. Then another concept entered their minds, heavier than the rest. You may join. The meaning was clear enough. Joining did not mean simply falling into the singularity's mass. It meant becoming part of what it was, folded into its impossible geometry, existing beyond the reach of time, carried within the mind of the black hole itself. The crew's reaction was mixed. Some felt an almost magnetic pull toward the offer, an urge to surrender to something so vast, so complete. Others recoiled instinctively, unwilling to give up the fragile but precious boundaries of selfhood. The singularity did not push. It waited. The figures moved again, circling slowly. The crew noticed now that their shapes were not entirely alien. There were hints of familiarity in them. A tilt of the head that recalled a childhood friend. A way of standing that mirrored the captain's own posture. The black hole was wearing these shapes for their benefit, shaping its presence into something the human mind could tolerate. And then, in a shift so sudden it felt like a gasp, the singularity directed its attention at each of them individually. For the engineer, the memory of a dismantled machine rebuilt perfectly. For the physician, the sound of a heartbeat slowing into stillness, then starting again. For the linguist, a sentence in a language they had never learned, yet fully understood. For the captain, a vast, unbroken horizon under a sky where no sun had ever risen. Each vision came with the same undercurrent. I know you. I could keep you. The meaning was not threat, but possibility. If they chose, they could surrender here. They would not die, not in the sense they understood. They would simply be held, their essence preserved within the singularity's endless folds. Then came a final, layered concept that landed in their minds like a seed. Or you may leave, but leaving will change you. It was not warning, it was certainty. The captain stood still for a long moment, the crew waiting in the same held breath. Then, slowly, they spoke, not aloud, but in thought, shaping the question so clearly that the singularity could not miss it. Why us? The answer was slower this time, unfolding in multiple layers. Because you came, because you carry, because I am not finished becoming. The structure's folds deepened, and for an instant, the crew felt what it might be like to be part of it. Endless perception, infinite depth, the sensation of touching every moment in time at once. It was overwhelming, and it was beautiful. Then the pull eased. The figures stepped back, their forms blurring again into half-seen silhouettes. The signal softened, its harmonics stretching out like the last notes of a song. The concepts in their minds grew fainter, dissolving back into private thought. The singularity had not dismissed them. It had simply left the choice in their hands. The path was not a line, but a suggestion, thin and luminous, stretching through the darkness like a thread caught in an unfelt wind. It shimmered faintly, bending and curling in ways that made distance impossible to judge. The AI called it a navigational anomaly. The crew knew it for what it was, the singularity's gift. The Odyssey Dawn followed without question. The engines murmured at a steady, almost reverent pace. There was no need for acceleration. The space ahead seemed to invite them forward, as though their movements were being assisted by something far greater than thrust. Outside, the blackness was not uniform. Faint glimmers pulsed in the distance, points of light that came and went like the slow blink of a sleeping giant. Some pulsed in rhythm with the faint after-echo of the singularity signal, others in patterns that felt unrelated, alien in a different way. None of them behaved like stars. The crew avoided staring too long, instinctively aware that these glimmers were not things meant for direct comprehension. Time within the ship slipped further from its old meaning. The clocks ticked, but the intervals between their beeps felt inconsistent, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, even though the AI insisted no drift had occurred. Meals were taken not on schedule, but when someone's body simply knew it needed food. Sleep came in scattered waves, unmoored from the concept of night. The captain spent most of their hours in the observation deck, watching the thread of light ahead. It never wavered, never dimmed, but it did shift, subtle bends, sudden angles, loops that arced gracefully before returning to their forward direction. The captain knew these were not accidents. The path was navigating them through an environment no human instrument could chart. The crew spoke less now. Words seemed insufficient, their edges too sharp to hold what they were feeling. Communication happened in gestures, in shared glances, in the occasional thought half-formed and left unfinished. The experience of the singularity still lingered in them, and something about that connection made silence more eloquent than speech. The ribbon of light passed through regions where the darkness grew thicker, almost tangible. In these places, the ship's sensors reported no measurable particles, no electromagnetic signatures, only a strange, low-frequency vibration in the hull, like a distant voice humming a single, endless note. The crew felt it in their bones, and it reminded them of standing near the central structure in the Singularity's chamber. Once, the path widened suddenly, revealing a broad, circular clearing in the darkness. Here, the void was not empty. It was filled with slow-moving shapes, translucent and massive, their outlines shifting like fluid. They drifted across the clearing without sound, their movements graceful but deliberate, as though they were aware of being watched. Some came close enough that their surfaces brushed faintly against the Odyssey Dawn shields, leaving ripples of light in their wake. No one spoke. The ship simply drifted between them, the ribbon of light guiding its course until the shapes fell away behind. The AI registered no collision, no contact. Yet each crew member felt as though they had been touched. The path continued. Days, if they were still days, passed without event. And yet, the crew began to notice changes within themselves. Memories surfaced with unusual clarity, details sharper than they should have been. The smell of a childhood home. The exact shade of light on a long-forgotten afternoon. The sound of a lost voice, perfectly recalled. These memories came without warning, often in moments of stillness, and always carried with them the faint resonance of the singularity signal. The physician recorded physiological changes, elevated neural activity during rest, minor fluctuations in heart rate patterns, faster reflex responses. None were harmful. If anything, they suggested enhancement. But no one knew whether these changes would last, or what they might become. Halfway along the path, if such a point could be measured, the ribbon of light began to twist upward in a slow spiral. The ship followed, and with each rotation, the darkness outside began to shift. Patterns emerged, long, sweeping arcs of faint luminescence, like the trails of ancient comets frozen in time. They curved around the path in deliberate symmetry, and for the first time since leaving the horizon, the crew felt the presence of order in the void. The linguist stared at these arcs for a long time before speaking. "It's language," they said softly. Not written in symbols, but in movement and geometry, the arcs forming a grammar of distance, curve, and relation. The ribbon was not just a road, it was a sentence being spoken, and the Odyssey Dawn was the subject of it. The thought brought both awe and unease. If this path was a sentence, who or what was reading it? The spiral straightened again, and the arcs faded into the darkness. Ahead, the ribbon seemed to narrow, its glow tightening, becoming sharper. The crew felt a subtle increase in momentum, though the AI reported no change in velocity. It was as if the space behind them had begun to push.
The dreams returned, not of the corridor, but of the singularity itself.
They saw its folds from angles that had not been possible before, perspectives that revealed endless depths within depths. The voice came again, not as it had in the chamber, but as an afterimage in thought. The path ends where it began, but it will not be the same place. No one questioned the meaning. They all knew the singularity meant the universe beyond, the space they had come from, but altered, or perhaps they would be altered enough that it would seem different. As the ribbon thinned further, the darkness around them began to brighten. Not suddenly, but with the slow inevitability of dawn. The black was giving way to faint, diffuse light, as though they were emerging into a misty atmosphere. Shapes began to form, soft outlines of stars, blurred and doubled as if seen through water. The crew leaned forward in their seats, unable to look away. The AI reported rising electromagnetic activity, faint radio hiss, and gravitational readings shifting back toward the patterns of normal space. They were approaching the edge. But the edge was not like the horizon they had crossed before. This boundary shimmered, its surface rippling with delicate patterns that reminded the crew of the frost spirals in the cooling vents. The patterns moved as though alive, their loops and curls unfolding into new shapes faster than the eye could follow. The captain realized with a quiet certainty that this was not just the edge of the black hole's interior, it was the memory of their passage, folding itself closed behind them. The ribbon of light touched the shimmering boundary. And then, without warning, they were through. The ship shuddered, not violently, but with the deep, full-body resonance of something being returned to a place it had not been for a long time. The view ahead cleared, and space lay before them. Real space, with stars that held steady, constellations that did not bend or shift. The accretion disk blazed behind them, its brilliant ring framing the darkness they had just escaped. But the stars were wrong. The captain recognized some constellations, but their positions were slightly off, as though centuries had passed and stellar drift had redrawn the sky. The AI began cross-referencing the patterns, and within minutes the answer came. They had emerged thousands of years ahead of the time they had left. Silence filled the bridge. Not shock, just the slow, settling weight of comprehension. The universe they had known was gone, replaced by one they would have to learn from the beginning. The path had delivered them back into space, but not into their own time. And deep within each of them, the singularity's pulse still echoed. The Odyssey Dawn drifted in silence, her engines idle, her crew staring at a sky both familiar and alien. The black hole's accretion disk glowed far behind them, its swirling fire a reminder of the impossible journey they had just survived. But ahead, the stars told another story, a story they did not yet understand. The AI confirmed the captain's suspicion. The constellations had shifted, but not by decades or centuries. They were thousands of years forward from the time they had departed. The ship's chronometer was now meaningless, a relic from a universe that had moved on without them. No one spoke at first. They didn't need to. The truth settled in the room with the quiet certainty of a final door closing. The world they had left was gone, not destroyed, but altered beyond recognition by the slow, relentless passage of time. It was the linguist who broke the silence, their voice low. "We're not returning, we're arriving." The words sank into each of them differently. For the engineer, it was a calculation, new coordinates, new unknowns. For the physician, it was a shift in responsibility, how to keep them alive in a future with no anchor. For the captain, it was both weight and clarity. The path ahead would not lead them home. It would lead them somewhere else entirely. The black hole was still visible behind them, but its presence felt different now. It no longer pulled. It simply watched, the faint echo of its signal still thrumming in their bones. That resonance had not faded since they left the horizon. It was quieter now, more like the memory of a sound than the sound itself, but it was still there, proof that part of them had not left the singularity at all. They set a slow course away from it, not toward any specific destination, but into the open space of this new universe. The AI began its work, scanning for known systems, trying to reconcile old star maps with their shifted positions. The task was monumental. Thousands of years had erased familiar alignments, and what they found would be as alien as anything they'd seen inside the horizon. The crew adapted in silence. There was no panic, no despair, only the calm acceptance of travelers who had already crossed the most impossible threshold imaginable. After all, what was time to people who had stood in the mind of a black hole? It was during these first hours of travel that they began to notice changes. Subtle at first, then undeniable. The engineer found themselves anticipating system fluctuations before the AI reported them, as if the ship's mechanics whispered directly into their thoughts. The physician could diagnose small irregularities in her crewmates without instruments, sensing shifts in body rhythms like reading weather from the sky. The linguist began to feel meaning in the electromagnetic static of distant stars, as though faint patterns were spelling out messages no one else could detect. Even the captain noticed it, a heightened awareness, a sense of trajectory, not measured in navigation charts, but in instinct. They could feel the pull of destinations, the way one might feel the tilt of a slope before seeing it. None of them spoke of these changes at first, but one night, if it could still be called night, the captain found the linguist in the observation deck, watching the stars. They didn't look away when they spoke. "It's still with us." The captain didn't ask what they meant. They both knew. The singularity had given them more than a path out. It had marked them, reshaped them in ways they were only beginning to understand. As the Odyssey Dawn pushed further into the future sky, they began to encounter signs of life. Not ships, not yet, but faint signals drifting through space. Some were too degraded to parse, fragments of languages that might have been human, might have been something else entirely. Others were complex, dense, carrying structures that reminded the linguist of the black hole's folded geometries. The engineer suggested altering their course to investigate. The captain agreed. Not because they expected to find the descendants of their people, but because the signals carried the same subtle pull as the ribbon of light inside the void. It was not identical, but it was close enough to stir a deep recognition. Weeks, or what they thought were weeks, passed before they found the source, a cluster of stations orbiting a star older and redder than the sun they had left behind. The stations were not like any human design the crew had seen. Their shapes were organic, their surfaces alive with slow patterns of light that shifted like breathing. The AI detected power, atmosphere, and structural integrity, but no active transmissions. The crew debated approaching, but the decision came easily in the end. They had crossed a black hole. There was little left to fear in the empty space between worlds. As they drew closer, the patterns of light on the stations began to change. The linguist leaned forward in their seat, their breath catching. "It's speaking." The captain looked to the AI for translation, but it was the linguist who answered first. "It's not words, it's recognition." The station was aware of them. And as they closed the final distance, something remarkable happened. The echo of the singularity's pulse in their bones, the subtle, ever-present rhythm, aligned perfectly with the station's shifting lights. The crew felt it in unison. This was not chance. The singularity had guided them here. Whether these stations were built by the singularity's influence, by civilization shaped by it, or by something else entirely they didn't know. But the path they had followed through the void had not ended in open space. It had ended here. The figures from inside the horizon never appeared again, but their absence was not emptiness. In their place was a sense of being expected, as if the crew were not visitors, but arrivals long prepared for. The captain gave the order to dock. Inside, the air was breathable, the gravity stable. The corridors were smooth and curved, just enough to echo the dreamlike halls of the Singularity's chamber. They walked together, their footsteps quiet on the unfamiliar floor. And though they saw no inhabitants, they felt watched, not with hostility, but with the same attentive patience they had felt in the black hole's presence. At the heart of the station, they found it, a structure smaller than the Singularity's, but similar in its impossible geometry. It pulsed gently, not with the overwhelming weight of a black hole's mind, but with a steady, measured rhythm, as if scaled for the human frame. The linguist stepped forward, their hands trembling. "It's asking." The captain didn't need to ask what the question was. They already knew. The choice had returned, not to join or to leave, but to step forward into the next path, whatever it might be. The crew stood in silence, the same silence that had surrounded them in the Singularity's chamber. Outside, the black hole's light was long gone, but inside, its echo lived on. The captain glanced at each of them in turn. There was no fear in their faces now, only the calm understanding that they were no longer the people who had left their time. They were something else, something shaped by the oldest and hungriest thing in the universe. And then, without ceremony, they stepped forward together. The pulse in their bones quickened, the lights on the structure flared. And the Odyssey Dawn, though still resting in the docking bay, began its next journey, not away from the Singularity, but deeper into the web it had woven across time and space. The future, they realized, was not something waiting to be reached. It was something that had already been watching them all along.